Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Today we wanted to explore when it's difficult to make decisions. And I think this is something that we've all seen in our practices where people come in and may be very stuck over sometimes big decisions that have important consequences, but I think more often things that perhaps are not so weighty, but somehow it is difficult to land on a clear choice.
Yes, I think this shows up as a clinically significant when people come in and they feel an enormous amount of pressure and they know that they should be clear-headed about accepting a new job, relocating to a new place, or honestly, even just cleaning out their attic and throwing things away.
Absolutely.
But these issues will come into the consulting room and people will perseverate about them for months, sometimes
that's
years.
A good word, like perseverative. And I also think it's interesting that you landed on cleaning out the attic and you said, okay, because there does seem to be some kind of overlap that I don't quite understand between the sort of analysis paralysis over these little decisions and stuff. Sometimes it's decisions about stuff. Sometimes the decision-making difficulty goes along with feeling that you have too much stuff. Not sure what that is. Perhaps we're too caught in materiality and can't enter imagination enough. Something like that.
What I've heard people say is also, I put it in the category of loss, that people are afraid they will make a mistake if they give this item away or sell it or just get rid of it, or they do B instead of A and have regret and feel the feeling that I've made a mistake. It cannot be undone.
So it's like almost like a fear of making a mistake.
And the fear of remorse, particularly.
Exactly. The loss and the remorse of I've taken the wrong path. So it may be over something, relatively mundane, let's say a little table lamp that has no objective particular value, but that feeling of regret and of loss, that I have lost something that is now not recoverable, cannot be undone.
One of the things that around loss that I notice is that often this is associated with feeling types, and feeling types will often invest objects with memories, so that there's a way in which, that lamp specifically brings to mind 8 or 9 different and perhaps precious memories. And then consequently, if the lamp were to be disposed of, the person fears, I think on an unconscious level, that they will lose access to that nest of memories. So everything begins to feel like a feeling invested treasure, and there's very little appreciation of the problem that it is to keep hoarding at its worst level, but to not be able to let anything go.
I think it even goes into more existential places than that as well, because it's an inability to accept, in some sense, the idea of mortality, that everything ends and that you can't keep it all forever, that you have to let it go, that things have to pass away, that some things will become just a memory. It's wanting to keep it all fixed in some kind of concrete form.
And that change and loss somehow have become synonymous, maybe.
It becomes concretized, that this is the item that so-and-so gave me. This is the item that I have as a keepsake from Aunt Agatha. And if I get rid of this item, somehow Aunt Agatha is also gone, even though she may have been deceased for 20 years.
Well, it's sort of an avoidance of mourning almost.
It can be, I think, in that circumstance, allowing the inner image to change and to actually adapt to the outer realities.
I mean, that brings up the image of, is it Mrs. Havisham from Great Expectations? jump in if I'm getting this wrong, but she was supposed, this is Dickens, right? She was supposed to get married and she was dressed in her trousseau and, or I guess her wedding dress or whatever. And she was stood up at the altar. And so for the rest of her life, in the novel, she's this little old woman in a wedding dress. There was no acceptance of this terrible loss. And so she just remained sort of frozen in time.
Wow, that's really powerful, of the importance of mourning and also the impulse to avoid it. I still have something from Aunt Agatha. I still have these things that she made. And I'm also thinking that you hinted at something of how making decisions can also be a way of keeping open all the possibilities and being up in the air rather than here we are on Earth in a reality that demands acknowledgement and demands action and demands a certain kind of ability to let go in order to move on.
Yeah, I think you just put your finger right on it, because of course in choosing this topic, we weren't just thinking of difficulty choosing to get rid of items. We're talking about all kinds of decisions. It might be, do I get a dog or do I not? And somehow someone gets just really stuck there and it gets invested with all this meaning. And I think part of it is what you just talked about. When you choose something, you are saying no to something else.
Yes.
You are closing a door. You are closing off some other possibility. If you get a dog, there will be things you can't do. And it will mean that you can't get a cat. Maybe. So
it will mean that you have to go home after work to walk the
Yes.
dog. It will mean that you can't go on certain trips or vacations.
It is a conscious
on and on.
acceptance of limitation.
Bingo.
And sometimes that is very hard. And where you can't do that, you will be stuck. There's this movie I sort of like called High Fidelity with John Cusack. And he has this great quote in it where he says something like, I thought I was going to try to keep all my options open, keep, 1 foot in and 1 foot out. But then I realized that that's suicide by tiny, tiny increments. There is a way that is, because when you never get into life, to get into life, you have to make a decision. If you're poised on the edge,
You're living in fantasy.
You're living suspended in the air. You're living in a fantasy. And to really get into life, you have to choose something. And sometimes it doesn't even really matter so much what, just pick something.
Yes, because if it's a mistake, you will learn from it. You'll feel the feelings, you will learn from it, and you'll learn that it's survivable, that you're resilient, and now you know something that you didn't know before, and that the mistake it can also be a contribution to your growth, to your awareness. And we do make mistakes.
And how we relate, or how the psyche responds to error or mistakes or to remorse, I think is very important. And in that realm, we come into the world of introjects. So with every action that we take, the psychic landscape responds in any number of ways, but some of us will have an inner imaginal figure that monitors our actions and our choices and can respond with this merciless, critical, punishing feeling and language that kind of runs like a tape in the back of the head. That's often based on early childhood experiences, either observed or lived, directed directly to us. But if we have a vicious inner critic, that can push people out of life and make them very frightened.
Absolutely true. So that there's such a fear of making a mistake or not doing it perfectly that it sort of you remain poised on the brink.
And so that's a parental, one would guess, a parental introject of the critical parent who may not have been quite that critical in real life, but gets felt and experienced and internalized as something severely harsh, severely critical, and that voice takes over that part of the psyche.
And so it makes us shy and risk averse, even when there are intelligent, well-researched risks. Just the fear of the introject will make us feel like we have to stay in the small area where that inner figure does not harass us. And often we don't know we're doing that. And that's part of the triumph about being able to find an internal image of the critic and being able to see that as a factor in the psyche and not as a truth about oneself.
Yeah.
So that inaction becomes preferable to action, because if you take action, it could be,
It's a
quote,
risk.
wrong. It could be a, quote, mistake. So it's better to do nothing. And of course, that's can be the biggest mistake at all. Then it's not just about this decision, whether to do A or B, but it's about getting into life and getting your hands dirty and all the rest of it.
And there is some research about people that have a lot of trouble making decisions. I mean, if you think about it, we in our modern culture are more, we have more decisions to make than probably anyone ever. There's just constant, you go to the store to buy some toothpaste and you've got 40 choices, so there's sort of decision fatigue constantly that I think many of us feel faced with. And it can induce a lot of anxiety. I mean, I think this goes along with a lot of anxiety. But the research says, and this goes along with what we're saying and makes a lot of sense, that most of the time, if you just pick something, people who just pick something in general tend to be happier than people who kind of overanalyze and overthink every decision. Just, relevant here is Jung's great quote, "The right way to wholeness is full of fateful detours and wrong turnings." Get out on the road and don't worry too much if it winds up being a fateful detour.
Now, one of the things I think we're leaning into with that and a few other comments is motivation. So somebody is sitting in their easy chair and they're looking at the open road and all their friends are saying, just get moving. Just get moving. Fate will intervene and you'll wind up in these extraordinary adventures. But there's something needs to happen in the psyche to have enough energy to kind of get on that motorcycle and kickstart it and get down the road. In terms of this, the way we imagine motivation in the psyche, Jung had, I think, a very new idea about the psyche in his time, is that the psyche is an energy system. And we called that energy libido. Freud felt that was mostly harnessed sexual energy, but Jung expanded that, feeling that libido could have all kinds of nuances. But he really imagined the inner life as a landscape and psyche as a force that moves much like water. So when he looked into himself and noticed where his interests were flowing, he thought of it as a gradient, literally as a hill had formed inside his psyche, so that the substance of life force, much like water, was beginning to move because of a natural gravity. So one of the areas that impressed me about this is in the introduction to his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And in the introduction, he says, "I'd been asked to write a biography for years and years and years, and I just refused. And suddenly a gradient formed, and I was willing to do it." So
yeah, it's a great image because, and Joseph, I think it was so just spot on that you went there, because you're right. I mean, what it takes to get out on the road and out of the easy chair is desire, is libido, is wanting something, and that is expressed by that image of the gradient. That we can follow the energy, but it has to be flowing somewhere. And there are people whose inner landscape is pretty flat.
And so things don't move, or if movement's going to happen, it's going to have to be generated in some other way. And many people have the experience that they live life from the ego, that the ego decides, oh, okay, I've got to take a shower because I know I have to take a shower, but there's nothing inside of me that thinks a shower is going to be pleasant or something to look forward to.
So if I had to wait for a gradient to form before I vacuumed my house, it would be pretty bad.
Yeah.
I don't know that a gradient would ever form for that.
So the ego has to have a certain amount of just life force, which is often generated just from the body itself, that we just have enough vitality at whatever age we are for the ego to grab onto a little tablespoon of energy to say, oh, okay, I'm going to vacuum. And if it can't do that, or if somehow the spoon keeps falling out of its hands, so to speak, or it's unwilling to commit that bit of life force to it, there's a problem.
What I'm thinking about is, in this context, is that, yes, we need to make some decisions in our head. We've got to vacuum, we have to do all kinds of things, take out the trash and wash the dishes and so on. And there's no big gradient that says, hooray, it's trash night. On the other hand, the downside of that is when people get trapped in their heads and analyze and think and analyze. And what you said a little earlier about that fate will intervene, of the feeling that there isn't any fate, there isn't any substructure, there isn't a feeling, there isn't energy, there isn't a kind of a gut sense that something else is there in me and in the world that will support me. All I have is me and this little circle in my head that has to think things as if that were the source of energy, as if that were the source of soul, as if it were the source of libido. So, how do we get that gradient? How does a hill, so to speak, shape in the psyche so that there is the gradient for the water to flow down? It has to be more than ego.
Yeah, I find this a difficult place to work in because there is very little, I think, that one can do. You have to sort of wait on the psyche. So as the analyst in a situation, waiting with someone, for example, who might be looking for a gradient to form, I think that our job winds up being witnessing and companioning. But we can't really constellate that for them, although sometimes people look for us to.
I think we have to turn to psyche and turn to the unconscious, which is one of the reasons we work with dreams, is they're available as a source, a pathway, a channel into the unconscious every single night, that it has to reside elsewhere. And that's why we do this work, which is depth work, Jungian work, and not just cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yes. And I'm still with this idea of being in the analytic room with a client who is stuck and maybe has been stuck for a long time, can't make what would seem to be essential choices. And that is, in one way or another, always what brings somebody into particularly an analytic environment, because the life force in its natural current has somehow been subverted by something. So whether it's a complex, whether it's some archetypal invasion, we don't know. But our hope and our job, so to speak, is to do what we can with our basket of resources to help facilitate this unsticking process. And yes, companioning somebody is part of it, but I also think, and this is this takes a tremendous amount of courage on both sides. It is for the analyst to speak the unspeakable as part of the
I would agree with that.
That really landed with me. To be the voice of reality, to be the voice of an inner truth that has been in shadow, and to lift that up into consciousness. It's a confrontation, really, with the analyst serving as the vehicle for a confrontation with the unconscious.
Absolutely. I have certainly had in my consulting room people that are stuck, and with a little bit of courageous work on both parts, that underneath the field of stuckness is a quantity of hatred that is blinding and shocking to them. And yet it was just barely under the surface. But the fear that if their anger or hatred were to be known and were to be expressed, that fear and the need to block that off takes so much energy.
Yes.
Inside the psyche that there is barely enough energy to brush the teeth or to get a job.
It's like a psychic form of agoraphobia, where people are afraid to leave the house or afraid to leave a certain neighborhood. It comes from the Greek fear of the marketplace. It's where the psyche delineates a smaller and smaller area for action, decisiveness, engagement. And as with agoraphobia, the territory tends to get smaller and smaller and smaller.
And the criteria is, what can I still safely do and feel that I'm distant from the underlying hatred? And you're right, it gets smaller and smaller. And the defense to the hatred can become exotic, whether it's overeating or any number of other indulgences to keep suppressing the discomfort of the hatred, because all of us know what hatred feels like. It feels horrible to the person who is experiencing the hatred, let alone whoever might be the object of it.
Hatred of what?
That can vary. And it often is not logically related to the thing
the
that's
symptom,
avoided.
Right.
I want to call it rage instead of hatred, because hatred feels cold, and I have a hunch that underlying this is something that's really hot.
Or maybe it could be either.
Okay.
I mean, I haven't quite formulated it like this.
But your question is such a good one, whatever we want to call it, and whether it's hot or cold or both, it's about what?
Well, what you may be leaning towards, Deb, is an old, profound insight that the Freudians came up with, is that much depression is in fact repressed anger, and anger turned towards the self. And I have lots of evidence of that being the case.
Yeah.
And we can think of the inability to make a decision as in the spectrum of that depressive dynamic where the life force is depressed, and so it cannot move towards an object, an inner or outer object, and then mobilize the different resources inside somebody to make it happen. So any blocking off is going to leave the image as kind of ephemeral. So that's what I think of it as. Many people who are stuck in a decision are often very bright. They're not terribly low functioning. So I imagine as they detailed for me their options, why they are so pastel, why they are so gauzy, and what is actively blocking this life force from penetrating and lighting up any number of those choices, because that's what gets us moving. And we're just wired that way.
Anger also is or can be activating.
Yes.
So you block that off, and
it's full of life.
Yes, it's full of life, and block that off if it has been one of those forbidden emotions from childhood of you can't express rage, you can't protest, you can't disagree. Anger is a no-no. You have to be a good boy or a good girl, and good boys and good girls don't yell at their mother or father or protest going to school and act out in school. That if you suppress the anger, you're suppressing a lot of the life force, which can lead to immobilization. And
that's core to, I think, analytic thought and core to the work that we do.
I want to maybe shift this in a slightly different direction. I think, first of all, it's interesting that we made this comparison between a difficulty making a decision with a kind of hoarder symptomatology. And I suspect that they are indeed related. I mean, for one thing, you just have to decide to throw things out, which can be really difficult for people.
Yeah.
But there's another concept here, too, that this touches into for me. And this is Jung's concept of the puer or puella, which those, of course, are the Latin words for boy and girl, respectively. And this was a manifestation of, we want to call it psychopathology, that Jung outlined, where the person remains in a psychologically childish state and doesn't manage to pick up the mantle of adulthood and get out into the world. And there's some things that go along with this, sort of an avoidance of responsibility. And I think there's some overlap here with some people, perhaps, who are very stuck in decision-making, might have a little touch of this.
I think that that's uncovered often in the underlying questions that they're asking themselves. When I find myself saying to a client, ask better questions, I'm usually addressing the puer attitude. For instance, there's an array of decisions in front of someone, and they look at me and they say, but I don't know which one will make me happy. And that is a paralyzing question. That's not a good question.
No, it's not.
Because it implies that you could predict what will affect your state in that way. It assumes that you should live a life where that particular emotion is paramount in its importance. It means you would have enormous amounts of control over all kinds of factors, which we don't really have. It's a paralyzing question. And I'll often be rather firm in the audience, in the consulting room, and say, I'd rather hear about what would be meaningful to you. And I hope that over time we can understand that a rewarding life involves a whole spectrum of feelings.
Yeah, there's a couple corollaries to that. I mean, for one thing, I think that perhaps it is correct to say that if you become aware that you're afraid to do something, that means you ought to do it, because that is where the growth is. I mean, I'm not going to make that a blanket statement, but I think that's worth thinking about. And Jim Hollis, the analyst, has a different framing of that, but it's similar in essence. He says, will doing this thing make my life larger or smaller? The answer, in case you were wondering, is that you ought to pick that which will make your life larger.
So let's just lift up the name of this author and celebrated Jungian analyst. His name is James Hollis, and he has written a number of books, and we will put links to some of them in the show notes.
So another author who addresses this in a way that I just recently had come across is I was reading a biography of James Hillman, who's a very influential Jungian who went on to form another school of psychology based on Jung's ideas, archetypal psychology. And he was talking about his early experiences of becoming a writer, which he started at quite a young age, and how he had this enormous agony about approaching writing tasks and his avoidance of writing. And he framed that as, in retrospect, an understanding that because writing was going to be his destiny, and because so much of the self was leaning into the action of writing, that his young ego couldn't respond any other way than being terrorized by it because of the magnitude of engaging it. Of course, he wrote that in a way that was much more elegantly said. But I think about that also, that something has to happen in the ego to actually be in relationship to one's destiny. And that goes to what you were saying, Lisa, about the action that gives us the greatest amount of reaction can be pointing to our destiny.
Yes. I mean, yeah, this sort of what has the most heat maybe is the thing that we need to move toward, even if that heat manifests as fear, because there's something there for us, perhaps. I also think about, making a choice to kind of go back to this idea of mourning means that we have to let go of the other thing that we won't have. And it means accepting the ordinary human fate. There's some people, I had a personal friend once who, she was dating someone for a really long time, and then finally they got engaged. And years later, she would joke around about how he had to give up on the fantasy that he was going to marry a supermodel. Like to pick someone to marry. This is, in the tarot, the marriage card is called the decision sometimes, because that is in some ways such the archetypal decision. You're choosing a mate. You're choosing one out of all the others you could have. You're closing all of those other doors, and you're saying, this is the path I'm going to walk. And inevitably, when you do that, you're limiting yourself. You're accepting something ordinary, because you know what? All of us, we're all ordinary. So when you wind up choosing your mate, yes, we're all extraordinary, but we're all also ordinary. And you're having to settle down into an ordinary human life. And for some people, that's really hard. And they would rather avoid that.
And I think it is inherently hard. There's an ancient Hermetic axiom that form disciplines force with merciless severity to actualize its full potential.
Wow, that's really good.
So when we think of the force of our fantasies or our passions or our expectations, and to submit them into incarnating, into taking form, that there is a discipline. There is always a discipline. The discipline of being married, the discipline of becoming a physician, the discipline of becoming an analyst. And there's a severity that we undergo in those disciplines, but if it is shaped in the right way, it is in service to actualizing the full potential of the indwelling fantasy.
Or at least some good enough version of it.
Yes.
Because I think it's probably, the reality is probably never what the fantasy is, but we can have some version of it, and it might be a pretty darn good version of it.
And the potentials of the fantasy are not visible in the initial fantasy. That is why we need the discipline of incarnation, the discipline of form.
Yep.
Is that
it has to get incarnated.
Yes, and then there's 1,000 other nuances of the original image that we could not have predicted, but must come forward as part of the incarnating dynamic.
Yeah, I'm thinking of an example. I have a friend who just knew she wanted to be a writer. She wanted to be a writer. And of course, there's lots of different ways to be a writer. I became friends with her more in sort of middle adulthood. And we were talking about that dream to be a writer. And she said, well, I make my living writing now. She's a freelance writer. And that's pretty good. So she hasn't written the, next great American novel, but she is making a living writing. And that is a pretty satisfying outcome for her. So I think, it's sort of, did she imagine exactly that? No, I don't know that she did. But as she followed that life force and allowed life to shape her and give that fantasy form, this is what arose.
Yes.
And there is something inherently gratifying in that incarnating of the fantasy in whatever form it can take, which is why, for instance, people who don't normally do art, they may go to a class and do a piece of artwork, and they'll often feel so thrilled with the artwork that, you put it on a table in the living room, you find excuses to kind of walk by it a few times, to just regard it, because this flow of life force that is exemplified in the creation of that piece of art is so gratifying and so engaging.
The person was alive and in his or her creative depth when it was created. I'm going back to your idea, Lisa, of the puer and the puella, of sort of the eternal child. And the myth of Adam and Eve and having to leave the garden of potential, of perfection, of things being provided. And what happens when we refuse to do that and take the risk of eating the forbidden fruit. And it can be cold and hard out there, but I can see underneath all this that fear of, will I be okay? Am I going to make it? What if I don't like it? What if there's nothing to eat? I'm going to miss being in the garden. And yes, you are going to miss being in the garden. And like your friend who became a freelance writer, there will also be the real world, very ordinary gains for you of being able to live in this world. And that is where we have to live.
Yes.
This is what we have been given.
Manifesting.
This is the world we live in.
Life.
Yes. And to not decide is to not be in life. And that's a terrible price to pay.
So it's funny, we started talking about having trouble making decisions, and somehow we slid into the light part about it, about sort of manifesting and the life force taking form in these different ways. But going back to being really stuck and not being able to do that. If someone out there is in that situation, what do we have to say to them?
I don't find in myself a particularly clever or packaged approach to that. I think that it requires that kind of classic circumambulation phenomena that Jung talks about, where we put the problem in the center of the room, and then as we squeeze it with our concentration, with our interest, and we keep following the trails of the associations and the images and the body states and the feelings that come out of it, then we might begin to put together the larger underlying picture. And what I imagine is, and what we often find, is that there really is a desire. There is an image that is desirable, whatever else an outside person may think of it. And that the ego is somehow not able to join or to create a relationship with that desired image. And so in this circumambulation, we are looking for what needs to be confessed, what needs to be worked through, what needs to be understood, so that the ego can actually marry this image that is authentic and in the soul. And there's an ancient Kabbalistic idea that our desires are God's promises to us.
Oh, that's beautiful.
The difficulty is that there's a lot of different motivating agendas inside of us, and they're not all desires. And often that's the working through. For instance, we have appetites, which are different from desires. And we see this, even somebody who might be paralyzed about making a decision to move, which needs to happen, or someone who's hoarding and make a decision to throw some things away. But the appetite to eat, the appetite to have a glass of wine, or do some other things, that level of body communication still can mobilize the ego in adequate ways. Even the appetite to take care of the pet, whether or not it's good for them to have 25 cats in their house. But desires really come from the self. Mm-hmm. There are seeds in the depth of the soul that are germinating, that are calling energy to them, and that when they are blocked, often the psychic system will create a depression to pull life force to them.
And Joseph, I'm reminded that the word desire comes from the Latin decidere, from the stars. Mm. Mm. So it is something God-given, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. And the things that the culture wants us to do are not those seed desires, those star desires, and our appetites are not those star desires, all of which may require tribute. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's.
Absolutely, better.
We have to do some things that there's nothing in the soul that is interested in renewing your driver's license or your car registration or paying your taxes and a number of other kinds of things that the soul really has no interest in.
Well, it's the acceptance. I'm going back to Lisa's idea of being ordinary, of, with your example of vacuuming, of, this is part of ordinary life and all the things you just mentioned, Joseph. And we do give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and that's a hallmark of maturity, is paying your taxes and cleaning your house and all of the rest of the mundane kinds of things, and a limitation to some of the desires, but being able to appreciate what you have, like your friend who's a freelance writer. Is she Shakespeare? Is she Hemingway? No. But she is being herself and exercising her gift as an ordinary freelance writer, let's say. And that's not to diminish her gifts. Acceptance of being ordinary is a gigantic step, I think. We'll make mistakes, but we have to engage.
I want to answer my own question, sort of what would I tell someone? And I think, Joseph, you're right that there isn't one really bad answer. And these situations, in my experience, also tend to be quite unique as you unpack them. I mean, they have some things in common, but there isn't one straight path. However, I do find it helpful, sometimes just for myself, but sometimes this is something that I will share with someone too, to think about the archetype of the hero needing to be constellated. That sometimes I will say to someone, I will talk about the hero's journey and the need to slay the dragon, and that at some point, the hero's there alone with the monster and has had some help along the way. But at the decisive moment, the hero has to figure out how to slay the dragon. And that's some of the energy that sometimes is missing.
So you're talking about having access to aggression. We've talked about hatred and rage and aggression. You have to kill certain things in the psyche, symbolically speaking. It has to be this, not that.
Yes.
And we need our aggression. We need access to our aggression to make these choices. Of even something as banal as getting rid of that little table lamp is an act of aggression. I am rejecting you. I'm exiling you. I'm casting you out.
So there are dimensions of making difficult decisions that have to do with coming to grips with loss, the discrimination to cut away that which is no longer life-affirming or that is life-blocking, the kind of intense introspection that's required to separate out our appetites from cultural mandates to star-seeded desires that rise up from the self. And then there is a certain amount of heroic attitude to champion what it is that's truly alive inside of you and to do battle to bring that into incarnation and to submit to the disciplined process of making something real in the world.
It's a great summary.
So with that, let us transition to a dream.
So the dream for this week's discussion was submitted by a male, 33 years old, who's an instructional aide. Because the context in the life is often relevant to the dream, he tells us that he's been dating a woman from overseas for about 7 months. It's very intimate and intense, and they're planning on meeting in about 2 months. The dream. Last night, I had what felt like an important dream. I was in a big new house. In one room, I was just waking up with the cousin who is closest to me. The room was dark and filled with shadows. The other room was filled with light, and I saw a woman waiting for me to wake up. We had both gone to the kitchen, and as she got closer, she was a girl that I had a crush on in high school, in very much detail. In high school, I was always afraid to come talk to her. Now she was coming to me. She was wearing my boxers and tank top and saw me, and went right to the fridge and pulled out some tea. One of her friends was there too, whom I knew, but didn't know too well. We were all talking and having fun, but with me and her, we kept looking at each other, drinking tea and coffee. I had the sense that something great is coming into my life.
So maybe I'll just start my kind of very first pass on this dream by just noting that this is clearly the dreamer had very positive feelings about this dream. And I just want to highlight that that's actually somewhat unusual. Most dreams have a negative emotional cast to them. So this is a little bit unusual to have a dream that feels just very positive. What do we think?
Well, I think he's in the midst of a tremendous romantic feeling from the context. And I think it's very important that he's actually never met the person, but has been interacting in some way, I would imagine, through email or other kinds of dating
Joseph,
contexts.
email is so 1990s. I'm sure they're
Snapchatting and other kinds of much more hip ways of being connected. But that because they haven't had a lived relationship yet, I would imagine that there is a lot of projection and a lot of fantasy material that's woven into the relationship, which is in the category that we talk about as the anima.
Which is really getting constellated here, and you can see it in the dream. And of course, what's sort of lovely, I think, about this dream is that, yes, I think you're right that the streamer is in that place, but the woman in the dream is not the woman from overseas that he's in a relationship with, right? So the psyche is taking care to make a distinction between the outer person who's evoking these feelings and this inner image of a woman who is clearly very intimate with him because she's wearing his clothes. Mm-hmm. So there's a real closeness there.
Yeah, something is coming alive in his psyche as the anima, and the images of a girl that he knew in high school that he was always afraid to approach. He was always, and now here she's coming toward him wearing his boxers and a tank top. So something is being evoked in psyche as of his relationship with the feminine, that he can meet this girl now. They can have tea and coffee and they can talk.
It's very kind of casual and comfortable.
Casual and comfortable. And there's even another girl in there as well. One of her friends was there too.
And there's a cousin, and we don't know if the cousin is male or female, but of course there are 4 people.
There are 4 people. And I'm intrigued with the fact that one room was dark and filled with shadows, and the other room was filled with light.
So right there, those 2 things, that there are 4 people and there's a light room and a dark room, these would be symbols of wholeness if you're looking at it from a Jungian view. Jung felt that the number 4 there was a sense of wholeness and completion. And the light and dark being together would be bringing together the opposites, and there's this sense of wholeness or what we might call the sort of sacred marriage.
So something is happening in psyche. The tone is really wonderful, but the temptation is to equate it with the outer world woman that he's been having a distanced relationship with. They're happening one thing, and it may happen that they meet and fall in love, and it seems like a parallel construction, but it's really what we're paying attention to is what's happening in the psyche of the dreamer, that the relationship with the feminine is possible, it's fun, they're talking, and there's this sense of wholeness with the light and dark and the 4 people in the dream.
I think it really captures the feelings of hope and expectation. It's enlivening. And whatever the interaction is over 7 months of some kind of Snapchatting or Skyping,
WhatsApping,
has been enough to fuel this promise that things are going to be really great moving forward.
Well, and of course, there's this lovely detail about the house, which felt really important. So
yes,
again,
I was in a big new house.
Mm-hmm.
So it's his own house.
Mm-hmm. It's a new house. It's not the childhood. We're not in the childhood psychological situation anymore. We're in a new place, a new psychic place.
Yes.
And it's a big new house. So yeah, there is a great sense of promise here. And it may or may not be something that happens in the outer world in this relationship. But the streamer is certainly actually, apropos of our topic today, really moving into life, isn't he?
Yes.
That we know. We don't know exactly what's going to happen or what form that's going to take. But
we can say that the anima is getting close to him internally, and that seems to correspond with his fantasies of a romance.
Yes.
So I love that the word anima has the same root as the word animate, and that for a man, the anima principle, separate from it being garbed in the face of the high school friend, has an animating influence on the psyche. And we can sense how he feels animated in the dream, and his associations are full of hope and animation and life. Of course, the question always is, or the tension is, will the lived relationship, will the incarnating relationship really reflect the anima image, the animating fantasies? And this is the great tension of romantically driven love. Now we know, just to be very grounded, I'll tell my clients this frequently, is we know from research that the idealization stage of love, which psychologists called limerence, finishes up after 6 to 18 months. For the wide majority of people. So the projection of the idealized feminine stays on the partner anywhere from 6 to 18 months, often depending on the amount of dissonance with the image. Now, one of the things I find with these kind of online relationships is there isn't enough exposure to the other person's personality to be able to create that dissonance. So the idealized image can live and sustain much, much longer until there actually is enough lived experience side by side. So, I always feel a certain amount of support, people chasing their love, and a part of me which is, cautious and grounded and tries to help people have realistic expectations about meeting somebody for the first time.
It also strikes me that we've been sort of speaking about this, keeping it in the realm of, romantic relationships, but it's also possible that there's the new thing that's arising in his life, maybe elsewhere as well. I mean, I always think that anima and animus can say something about our creative life. So I would also be curious about what was going on in his professional life, or if he has any creative endeavors, perhaps that are feeling particularly alive right now.
I think that's an important question, to be able to imagine with him the various reservoirs in which the animating energy could fall. Because we want that. It isn't just about, kissing and making love and, staring into the eyes of the beloved, but the anima gets to animate the career and even the vision of owning one's own home, the animating principles. I also want to go back to another just interesting comment, that he's been dating the woman overseas for 7 months. They're going to meet in another 2 months, which will be a 9-month period.
Which is the classic gestational time frame.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So something's gestating here.
Yes, something is going to come to birth, and it's finally going to land and be in the hands and be observed.
And we shall see.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show, and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.